It was a quiet night in Mineral Point, Wisconsin, in the dead of winter. The kind of night where frost clung to every window and the air hung heavy with silence. The streets were deserted, the only sound being the occasional gust of wind that whispered through the trees and rattled the frozen branches. Officer John Pepper was on routine patrol, his headlights cutting through the darkness as his cruiser crawled along the snow-covered road. It was February 1981, and the small mining town was sleeping soundly. But what Pepper saw next would jolt him, and the entire town, into a mystery that would remain unsolved for decades. As he turned the corner near the old Graceland Cemetery, Pepper noticed movement, a shadow darting across the road. At first, he thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer startled by the car's lights, but then it stood upright. The figure was tall, pale, and human-shaped. Pepper slowed down, narrowing his eyes. The figure froze under the beam of his headlights, then turned its head toward him. In that instant, Pepper's breath caught in his throat. The man's face was ghostly white, with deep, sunken eyes that seemed to reflect no light at all. He was dressed entirely in black, a long cape or coat that flowed behind him in the wind. Before Pepper could react, the man bolted. Not just ran, but moved with a speed that was unnatural, almost gliding across the snow. Pepper slammed the car into park and jumped out, shouting for the man to stop. The figure sprinted toward the cemetery gates, its footsteps barely making a sound against the frozen ground. Pepper gave chase, his flashlight beam bouncing through the darkness as his boots crunched on the ice. But when he reached the entrance of the cemetery, the man was gone. No footprints. No sign of anyone hiding. Just silence and the faint whistle of the winter wind. It was as if the figure had vanished into thin air. Pepper radioed in the encounter, his voice shaky but controlled. He described the figure. Tall, pale, dressed in black, with eyes like nothing human. When dispatch asked for clarification, Pepper hesitated, then said something no officer in his right mind would want to say. It looked like a vampire. News of the encounter spread quickly. In a small town like Mineral Point, word travels fast. By the next morning, locals were already whispering about the Mineral Point vampire. Some laughed it off as a prank. Others weren't so sure. The area had a long history of eerie folklore, tales passed down from the days when miners first settled there in the 1800s. Back then, strange lights, ghostly apparitions, and creatures lurking in the old mines were common stories, the kind told to children to keep them from wandering too far at night. But this was different. This was an experienced police officer, not some overactive imagination. Over the following days, Pepper couldn't shake the image from his mind. He replayed the moment over and over, the pale face, the speed, the disappearance. He went back to the cemetery several times, hoping to find footprints or clues. But the snow remained untouched, smooth and clean, as if the ground itself had swallowed any evidence. Then, a few days later, it happened again. Late one night, a call came in from a frightened woman who lived near the edge of town. She claimed she'd seen a figure standing outside her window. Tall, pale, with glowing red eyes. By the time officers arrived, the figure was gone. The woman insisted she hadn't been dreaming. She said the thing had been watching her, unmoving, until she screamed. More reports trickled in. A man claimed he saw someone dressed in black standing at the gates of the cemetery just before dawn. Another resident said they found strange impressions in the snow near their porch, like claw marks. By now, the police department was fielding calls nightly. Pepper was reluctant to talk to the press, but rumors were spreading faster than they could contain them. The term vampire had taken hold, and soon newspapers began covering it, first as a curiosity, then as a local legend. For weeks, the people of Mineral Point lived in quiet fear. Doors were locked earlier than usual. Curtains were drawn tight. Parents warned their kids not to play outside after dark. It was as if the town had collectively stepped back into the old superstitions that had haunted their ancestors. But behind the hysteria, there was something strange. Several residents described the same thing. A tall man, dressed in black, moving unnaturally fast and vanishing before their eyes. None of them had spoken to each other before reporting it. None had reason to lie. And yet their stories aligned perfectly. When journalists began digging, they uncovered something unexpected. The Graceland Cemetery, where the first sighting occurred, had a reputation. For years, locals had whispered that it was haunted. In the 1960s, there were stories of glowing figures seen wandering between the gravestones, of disembodied voices echoing through the mist. Some even claimed to see a shadowy figure resting atop one of the old mausoleums, motionless, watching. But the cemetery wasn't just eerie by reputation. It was old. It dated back to the 1800s, when the first settlers from Europe arrived in Mineral Point, many of them Cornish miners. They brought their folklore with them, tales of knockers, spirits that haunted the mines, and of creatures that drained the life from men while they slept. When Pepper's report surfaced, older residents remembered those old tales. They said this wasn't the first time something strange had walked those grounds. One old miner even told a reporter, "We used to see things down there in the shafts, eyes watching from the dark, cold air where there shouldn't be any. You stay down there long enough, you start to feel like something's feeding off you." Whether he was speaking metaphorically or not, nobody could tell. But the sentiment echoed what many in Mineral Point were starting to feel, that something ancient had stirred, and that Pepper had just happened to cross its path. By March, the story had gained enough traction that nearby towns began sending curious visitors and paranormal enthusiasts. People camped near the cemetery, hoping to see the vampire for themselves. Local bars filled with talk of the Mineral Point Monster, as some began calling it. Pepper found himself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight. He maintained his account but refused to speculate. "I saw what I saw," he told one interviewer. "I don't care what anyone calls it." But his colleagues weren't so sure what to believe. Some thought he'd seen a prankster. Others quietly admitted that something about his story didn't sound like a lie. The town sheriff ordered additional patrols around the cemetery. For a while, the reports stopped. It seemed the strange visitor had moved on, or gone back to wherever it came from. But just as things began to calm, another encounter reignited the fear. It was April now, and two young men were walking home from a local bar late at night. As they passed near the cemetery, they heard footsteps behind them. When they turned, they saw him. Tall, pale, wearing black. They froze. The man stopped too, standing completely still in the middle of the road. Then, without warning, he sprinted toward them. The two men took off running, terrified until they reached the main road and flagged down a passing driver. By the time they looked back, the figure was gone. When police investigated, they found no tracks, no evidence of anyone hiding in the area. The temperature was below freezing. Any footprints should have remained clear in the snow. But there was nothing. Just like before, it was as if the creature had materialized and disappeared at will. Locals began to say that maybe it wasn't a man at all. Maybe it really was something supernatural. A creature that could move between worlds, feeding off fear itself. By now, the story of the Mineral Point vampire had escaped the boundaries of Wisconsin folklore and become part of American paranormal lore. It was mentioned in late-night radio shows, featured in local ghost books, and even appeared on TV segments decades later. Pepper eventually retired from the police force, but he never changed his story. Until his death, he maintained that what he saw that night was no human being. Even today, locals still speak about it in hushed tones. Teenagers dare each other to visit the cemetery after dark. Paranormal investigators occasionally show up, cameras in hand, scanning for cold spots or strange readings. And sometimes, just sometimes, a resident reports something odd. A fleeting shadow near the gates, a pair of eyes in the dark, a sudden chill when the air should be still. Whether it's legend, hysteria, or something much darker, no one can say for sure. But in the quiet of Mineral Point, when the fog rolls in over the gravestones and the wind whispers through the pines, some still swear they can feel it watching, waiting. In the weeks that followed, Mineral Point tried to return to normal. The frost began to melt, and with spring came the faint hope that the long, cold season of fear had finally ended. But for Officer John Pepper, the memory of that pale face lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. Each time he passed the cemetery gates, he felt the same chill crawl down his spine. He told himself it was over, that whatever he'd seen was gone. Yet, some nights, when the wind picked up just right, he swore he could still hear footsteps crunching softly over the gravel behind him, always stopping when he turned. The townspeople didn't talk about it much anymore, at least not in daylight. In private, though, the legend had taken on a life of its own. Parents used the story to keep their children inside after dark. Old miners in the tavern swore they'd heard of similar encounters generations before. They spoke of something that haunted the mine shafts when the town was young, a pale figure that drained warmth from the air and light from the lanterns. They said it moved faster than any man and left no trace behind, as if it were part of the cold itself. Local historians began digging into the cemetery's records. Graceland dated back to 1830, and its oldest graves belonged to immigrants who'd come from Cornwall, Ireland, and Eastern Europe. Among those names, a few stood out: Drago, Maravich, and Laszlo, families whose origins traced back to regions steeped in vampire folklore. One historian found an old newspaper clipping from 1893 about the mysterious exhumation of a miner, S. body, after several townsfolk had died of unexplained anemia. According to the report, the corpse was said to have looked fresh, with no decay, and a stake was driven through its chest to calm the fears of the townspeople. The paper dismissed it as hysteria, but the detail was too precise to ignore. When this story resurfaced, it reignited the old fears. Some believed the so-called Mineral Point vampire might be connected to that buried legend, that perhaps something had been disturbed when the ground thawed or when new construction near the cemetery began the year before. Whatever the cause, locals whispered that the thing Pepper saw wasn't new. It was awake again. Investigators from Madison and Chicago soon arrived, drawn by curiosity and media attention. Paranormal researchers set up night vision cameras and motion sensors across the cemetery. They camped there for days, huddled in the cold with their equipment, waiting for something to appear. Most recorded nothing but static and the sounds of animals in the brush. But one team claimed to have captured something unusual, a faint humanoid shape crossing the camera's infrared beam at 3 a.m. The figure moved too quickly for the frame rate to catch clearly, but the outline was unmistakable: tall, upright, and cloaked in black. Skeptics dismissed it as a technical glitch, yet those who had been in Mineral Point long enough weren't so sure. Around this time, a local teenager named Matt Hollis reported an encounter that would deepen the mystery. He and 2 friends were driving past the cemetery after a late movie when they saw a figure standing on one of the stone mausoleums. At first, they thought it was a prank, a mannequin, or someone in costume. But then it moved. It crouched low, as if ready to leap, and its eyes glinted red in the headlights. Hollis swore the figure dropped from the roof in one motion, landed silently, and then simply faded into the fog. The boys drove off screaming, not daring to look back. When questioned later, all 3 described the same thing in almost identical detail. They hadn't been drinking, and their fear seemed genuine. Police searched the area again. No footprints, no signs of tampering, no prank props, just the cold mist curling around the tombstones. As the legend grew, so did the folklore that surrounded it. People began to connect the sightings to earlier accounts across Wisconsin, the 1930s reports of a Batman near Jefferson County, the 1970s rumors of a creature haunting Holy Hill, and even tales from the 1800s of miners disappearing in the depths of the driftless area. It was as though the Mineral Point vampire had become the latest chapter in a story written across centuries. Reporters from regional newspapers came to town, turning the legend into headlines. Articles ran with titles like Vampire Stalks Wisconsin Cemetery and Fear Returns to Mineral Point. Tourists began arriving on weekends, drawn by morbid curiosity. Shops sold T-shirts and postcards. For some, the vampire became a joke, a bit of spooky fun for Halloween. But for others, especially those who lived near the cemetery, it was no laughing matter. They said the nights felt colder now, even in summer, that the air near the gravestones carried a strange metallic taste, and that sometimes just before dawn they'd see a shadow move against the rising fog when nothing else was there. Officer Pepper tried to ignore the renewed attention. He'd given up interviews and stopped discussing the incident publicly. But privately, he kept notes, sketches of what he'd seen, dates of similar sightings, and local weather patterns that seemed to coincide with them. One entry in his notebook from 1984 read, "Fog again, low temperature, cemetery lights flickered, movement behind the mausoleum. Same feeling, like being watched." Years passed, and still the story refused to die. In 1993, another officer, Jack O'Malley, claimed he saw a man in black leap over a 6-foot fence near the cemetery without touching the top. He chased the figure into the woods but lost him after just a few seconds. "It moved like nothing human," he said in a later interview. Once again, no tracks, no evidence, no explanation. Local folklore scholars began collecting the accounts, noting the patterns. Always near winter, always near the cemetery, always a pale man dressed in black. Some even proposed a scientific explanation, perhaps a rare atmospheric illusion caused by temperature inversions and fog density. Others speculated it was mass hysteria, the town feeding off its own legend. But there were also those who suggested something older was at work, something that predated the town itself. When archaeologists examined early records from the region, they found references to burial sites that predated European settlement. The indigenous tribes in the area spoke of shadow drinkers, spirits that moved in the cold months and fed on breath rather than blood. Whether coincidence or connection, the parallels were unsettling. By the late 1990s, the Mineral Point vampire had become a fixture of Wisconsin folklore. Ghost tours stopped at Graceland Cemetery, storytellers embellished the tale with each retelling, and late-night radio hosts debated whether the creature was a cryptid, a spirit, or something entirely unknown. But beneath the theatrics, one detail remained consistent, the sense that whatever haunted that ground had never truly left. Then came a chilling echo of the original sighting. In 2004, a local man walking his dog near the cemetery reported seeing a tall figure crouched beside a gravestone. At first, he thought it was another mourner, but when he called out, the figure rose, turned, and revealed a face so pale it seemed to glow. The dog began barking furiously, then whimpering. The man froze, heart pounding as the figure seemed to glide backward into the darkness, vanishing behind the tombs. When police arrived minutes later, the snow was undisturbed. After that, the stories once again faded into silence as they always seemed to, appearing in waves, disappearing for years, only to return when people had nearly forgotten. It was as if the legend itself followed a rhythm, tied not to time, but to something deeper, something buried in the soil and the fear of those who remembered. To this day, those who visit Graceland Cemetery at night say the place feels alive. The air thickens, the temperature drops, and even the bravest claim to feel eyes on them from somewhere unseen. Some bring cameras, others prayers. But all leave with the same unease, the sense that the man in black might still be there, waiting in the fog, watching from the shadows of a forgotten grave. Decades passed, and the legend of the Mineral Point vampire refused to fade into history. It clung to the town's identity like the frost that gathered on its rooftops each winter. Tourists came and went, investigators brought their cameras and gadgets, and storytellers carried the tale far beyond Wisconsin's borders. But for those who had grown up in Mineral Point, the vampire was more than a story. It was a shadow cast across generations. Children of the 1980s grew up into adults who remembered the fear in their parents' eyes, the way the streets emptied at sundown, the way the police cars lingered longer near the cemetery gates. In the early 2000s, a new wave of paranormal interest swept through America. Television shows about haunted places and cryptid encounters began airing nationwide, and Mineral Point found itself back in the spotlight. Producers from cable networks reached out to locals, wanting to film on-site, to hear first-hand accounts, to capture something eerie for their audiences. Many refused to talk. They said the town had suffered enough ridicule. But a few came forward, older now, their memories weathered by time yet still sharp with the chill of those nights. One of them was Sarah Montgomery, who had been a child when Officer Pepper's sighting made headlines. She recalled how her father used to double-check the locks every night, and how her mother forbade her from walking past the cemetery on her way to school. Even years later, she claimed that sometimes, on foggy mornings, she could see a shape standing among the gravestones. A man, unmoving, watching. She'd blink, and he'd be gone. When asked if she thought it was real, she hesitated, then said softly, "Whatever it is, it never felt like it belonged here." The paranormal teams that arrived were eager to prove or debunk the legend once and for all. They brought thermal cameras, EVP recorders, and electromagnetic sensors. During one investigation in 2006, the team captured strange fluctuations in temperature around the oldest section of the cemetery, near the 19th century mausoleums. The readings dropped by 10 degrees within seconds, as though something unseen had passed between them. One member reported hearing faint footsteps behind the camera setup, but when they turned, there was no one there. Later that same night, their audio equipment picked up a soft, whispering voice, a deep breath, almost like a sigh, followed by a single word: leave. Skeptics, of course, offered explanations. The cemetery was old, the stone structures porous, the air prone to rapid cooling. Sound could echo strangely between marble crypts. Yet, for those who had been there, the experience felt anything but ordinary. One investigator refused to return, claiming he felt something brush past him in the dark, cold and heavy like water. He said it left his skin numb for hours afterward. What made the Mineral Point vampire different from other legends was the credibility of its first witness. Officer Pepper had been a respected member of the force, known for his composure and integrity. There was no reason for him to fabricate such a bizarre story. He hadn't sought fame or fortune, and in fact, he avoided media attention altogether. The people who knew him swore he was never the same after that night. His friends said he grew quieter, more withdrawn, and that he avoided driving near the cemetery whenever possible. Some even said that, in his final years, he admitted he sometimes saw the figure again, not in person, but in his dreams. Always standing in the same place, silent, watching. Local historians began to weave together a more chilling theory. They suggested that perhaps the so-called vampire wasn't a creature in the traditional sense, but something else, a remnant of energy tied to the old mining tunnels beneath the town. The mines, many of which had been sealed off for decades, were said to run deep under Graceland Cemetery. Some believed that the constant digging and blasting had disturbed something ancient buried in those hills. There were records of miners who died mysteriously underground, their bodies pale and bloodless. Their deaths were blamed on gas leaks and exhaustion, but the pattern was unsettling. In 2010, a group of urban explorers managed to enter one of the old mines near the outskirts of town. They brought cameras, flashlights, and recording gear. For the first hour, everything was uneventful. Rusted equipment, collapsed shafts, the eerie quiet of a place long forgotten. Then, as they moved deeper, the air temperature dropped sharply. Their breath became visible, and their lights flickered. On the footage later recovered, one of the explorers can be heard saying, "Do you hear that?" followed by faint tapping sounds like metal striking stone, echoing from the darkness ahead. Moments later, one of their flashlights caught something reflective, a pair of eyes glinting faintly far down the tunnel. Then the feed cuts to static. When they emerged, shaken and pale, they swore they had seen a tall figure watching them from the shadows, unmoving, its face expressionless and white as chalk. The video went viral online, reigniting worldwide interest in the legend. Mineral Point once again became a destination for thrill-seekers and YouTubers eager to chase the supernatural. But the locals were less amused. Vandals began sneaking into the cemetery at night, damaging gravestones and filming cheap stunts. The town council imposed strict curfews and banned nighttime visits altogether. Yet, even with the restrictions, reports continued. Glimpses of something pale moving behind the trees, a sudden drop in temperature near the iron gates, the faint echo of footsteps when no one was there. As technology advanced, new evidence emerged. Grainy, uncertain, but enough to keep the debate alive. A security camera at a nearby house once captured a strange shape gliding past in the fog. Another from a local highway showed what looked like a tall silhouette crossing the road at impossible speed. Each clip fueled the mystery further. Each explanation only seemed to raise more questions. For many, the Mineral Point vampire had transcended folklore and become a reflection of fear itself. A reminder that even in a world mapped and measured by science, there are still corners where the unknown lingers. It became a subject of academic study, a case in cultural psychology. Why do small towns nurture legends like this? Is it a way to give shape to collective fear? Or could it be that certain places really do hold energies we can't yet explain? As the years rolled into the 2020s, new generations rediscovered the tale through podcasts, documentaries, and online forums. A local filmmaker produced a short film dramatizing the original 1981 sighting, bringing the legend back into popular culture. Interviews with surviving witnesses revealed the same unease, the same unwillingness to dismiss what they'd experienced. One older resident put it best. "It's not about believing in vampires. It is about knowing that something is out there that doesn't fit into the world we understand." Even now, visitors claim strange encounters near the cemetery. Some describe sudden static in their phones or cameras dying without explanation. Others report feeling watched from just beyond the edge of the light. A few even say they've seen him, the same tall man in black, pale and silent, standing in the mist as if time itself hasn't touched him. He never approaches. He never runs. He just watches. And maybe that's what keeps the legend alive. The unanswered questions, the feeling that the truth lies just beyond the reach of reason. In Mineral Point, the air still carries that quiet tension. Every gust of wind that rustles through the trees sounds a little too much like a whisper. Every flicker of light feels like a warning. And when the fog creeps across the old cemetery, swallowing the gravestones one by one, the town remembers. Because some stories never end. They simply wait for the next cold night to begin again. By the time the fourth winter rolled through Mineral Point, the legend had outgrown the town itself. News outlets stopped coming. The police refused to answer questions, and yet the story lived on. People came from miles away, walking the narrow streets at dusk, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature that had once sent a trained officer fleeing in terror. The tavern owners didn't mind. They sold stories along with their whiskey, and business was good. But underneath the laughter and local folklore, there was still that silent understanding that what had happened in 1981 was not a joke. Those who lived through it could never quite shake the feeling that something unnatural had brushed against their quiet little town. Some nights, the air itself felt different, colder, heavier, charged with that same tension Officer White had described. The sound of boots on gravel still made him uneasy. He had retired early, moved north to a cabin near the woods, but even there, he claimed the dreams never stopped. He would wake up drenched in sweat, hearing those same footsteps approaching from behind, slow and deliberate, echoing in the dark. The strange thing was, reports didn't stop after he left. In 1982, two teenagers cutting through St. Paul's Cemetery claimed they saw a pale figure crouched by one of the older graves. They said it moved like smoke, one moment there, the next gone. The boy who told the story swore he saw red eyes flashing in the moonlight, though his girlfriend insisted it must have been the reflection of their flashlight on marble. Still, she refused to walk home alone for weeks afterward. Locals began to connect old stories that had long been forgotten. Miners who disappeared in the late 1800s, tunnels sealed off after cave-ins that no one ever reopened, and whispers of a creature that once haunted the lead mines before the town was even built. Some of the oldest families in Mineral Point remembered their grandparents talking about it. The Pale Man, they'd call him, a tall figure that walked the ridges at night, feeding on livestock, leaving no tracks but draining every animal it touched. Researchers who later studied the case suggested that the vampire might have been a human intruder, a man suffering from delusions, maybe even a grave robber wearing an old costume. Skeptics dismissed the idea of anything supernatural, calling it a product of hysteria. But none of that explained the precision of the footprints Officer White found that night, perfectly formed, but vanishing abruptly at the fence line as if the creature had leapt away or simply disappeared. One retired investigator tried to revisit the site in the early 2000s. By then, the cemetery was different. Older, quieter, with the iron gate rusted and ivy creeping over the headstones. He found no trace of what had happened, of course, but locals warned him not to stay past sunset. When asked why, one elderly woman simply said, "Because it still walks when the moon is high." What makes the Mineral Point case so haunting isn't just the sighting itself, but the persistence of the fear. Even decades later, those who were there remember it with the clarity of a fresh wound. Officer White died in 2013, and at his funeral, his son spoke briefly about the night that changed his father forever. He said his father never spoke of the vampire again after that winter, but sometimes, late at night, he would sit by the window, staring out at the tree line, as if waiting for something. Today, people who visit Mineral Point describe it as peaceful, beautiful even. But when the sun sets and the last light fades from the hills, there's a strange stillness that takes over. The wind that sweeps through St. Paul's Cemetery seems to hum faintly, carrying with it a chill that feels almost intelligent, like a memory that refuses to die. Some visitors claim to have caught strange figures in the corners of their photographs, distortions that look eerily humanoid, too tall, too thin, too aware. Whether it was a real creature, a trick of the night, or the manifestation of something far darker buried in the collective mind of a small mining town, the Mineral Point vampire endures. It is a story that outlived its witnesses, that turned one man's terror into a legend, and one quiet town into a haunting. Because sometimes legends aren't born from fiction. Sometimes they're born from one moment of undeniable fear, a flash of red eyes, the sound of footsteps on frozen earth, and the chilling certainty that you are being hunted by something that should not exist. And even now, when you walk past those old iron gates, under the pale moonlight of Wisconsin's hills, some say you can still feel it. Watching. Waiting. Years later, after the story had long slipped from headlines and become a campfire tale, the town tried to forget. Tourists still visited Mineral Point, searching for the vampire's grave, for traces of the supernatural, for proof that something impossible had once walked among them. But the locals no longer laughed when asked. They just smiled politely, pointed to the old cemetery, and let the visitors find their own answers. One documentary team came through in 2008. They brought cameras, thermal scanners, electromagnetic sensors, all the tools of modern ghost hunters. For 2 nights they roamed the cemetery, capturing every gust of wind, every flicker of shadow. Nothing happened. On the 3rd night, just before packing up, one cameraman reported a sudden drop in temperature. His breath turned white in front of him even though it was summer. The audio recorded a faint metallic sound, like boots on gravel, approaching slowly from behind the mausoleum. Then came the static. The camera flickered, refocused, and for half a second a blurred figure appeared at the edge of the frame, tall, thin, glowing faintly in the infrared light. It was there, then gone. The footage aired only once before being dismissed as lens distortion, but those who watched it live remember the shape. After that, the cemetery was closed to nighttime visitors. The town quietly installed motion sensors and cameras, claiming it was to deter vandalism. Yet, even those devices would sometimes trigger without explanation. Lights flashing in the dead of night, alarms sounding for no apparent reason. No one ever saw what caused them. Folklorists began to study the story differently, not as a ghost tale, but as a psychological phenomenon. They said the vampire reflected the soul of the town itself, an echo of its mining past, of men who vanished underground chasing riches, never to return. The darkness beneath the hills, they said, had a memory, and sometimes it reached back into the world of the living. But there's another version of the story, whispered by those who have seen things they can't explain. They say the creature never left, that it's something old, older than the mines, older than the town, older than any name we have for it. Some even claim it predates the first settlers, that native legends spoke of a walker between worlds, a pale spirit that fed on the fear of those who entered its land without respect. Every few years, new reports surface. A truck driver passing through the area late at night swears he saw a figure by the roadside, motionless, pale as bone, its eyes catching the headlights like glass. A couple returning from a wedding in Platteville say something kept pace with their car for several seconds, matching their speed on foot. The husband laughed it off. The wife still won't drive that route after dark. In the quiet of modern Mineral Point, the story remains both alive and invisible, existing in that strange space between belief and denial. The town's tourism board never promotes it, yet locals still lower their voices when speaking about it. On the anniversary of Officer White's encounter, some residents light candles at St. Paul's Cemetery. They don't call it a memorial, just a little respect, as one man put it. The cemetery itself has changed little. The stones are older, cracked, weathered by frost and time. Moss grows thick where names have faded. But if you stand there long enough, if you wait until the wind dies and the world goes still, you might feel it. That ancient weight of silence, like the air itself is listening. Some say the vampire isn't a creature at all, but a memory, a remnant of fear imprinted so deeply on the land that it can still take shape under the right conditions. Others insist it's real, that what Officer White saw was no illusion, no trick of the moonlight, but a glimpse of something humanity was never meant to understand. And maybe that's the real heart of the legend. Not whether the creature existed, but how a single encounter can ripple through generations, changing stories, changing lives, shaping the identity of a place forever. Because in every corner of the world there are towns like Mineral Point, small, quiet, tucked away from time, where the impossible once happened, and people have spent decades trying to convince themselves it didn't. So, if you ever find yourself walking through Wisconsin's hills and you happen to reach the old gate of St. Paul's Cemetery, stop for a moment. Listen. The world there feels thinner somehow. The trees lean close, the shadows seem deeper, and every sound carries farther than it should. You might tell yourself it's just the wind. You might even believe it. But when the night is at its darkest, when the stars hang heavy and the air turns cold without warning, remember this story. Because somewhere, in that endless stillness, under the same moon that once lit Officer White's trembling hands, the legend of the Mineral Point vampire still breathes, waiting for the next name to be written into its shadow.